Hi, everybody. Here are the slides for the presentation. Would you all just let me know quickly that you can see and hear me with a quick yes in the chat box? Sorry, my monitors just shut it out and or just shorted out and got it back on, but wonderful. Good. I'm glad to see that. Wonderful. Well, hello. It's wonderful to be with you all today. My name is Stephanie Knight. I'm the Assistant Director at the Center for Applied Second Language Studies, which is one of 16 national foreign language research centers. We're located at the University of Oregon. And today I'm here to talk to you about one of my favorite projects that we have and the research behind it, and that is language portfolios in general, and more specifically, Linguafolio and Linguafolio Online, which I'm sure most of you are aware. Virginia, the state of Virginia, there is a free subscription available to you all. It's been covered by the state government. There was a grant for the next 3 academic years after this one completes. So we're in a really good spot, and it's a good time to pick it up. So we will, just to give you a little bit of my background, I have spent, let's see, the past 13 years in education. I've taught grades 5 through 16 in all forms and shapes and iterations that you can imagine. I taught Spanish 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, AP and IB. So I've taught the whole spectrum. I actually currently still teach online for a school in Texas. And so it's really, language portfolios in general are something that is really meaningful to me. When I was in my last high school, I created this wonderful proficiency-oriented language portfolio, and I really wanted my students to use it. And it was very autonomous, very student-driven, and as much as they liked it for a while, it became overly cumbersome. And when I started my work at Castles and was introduced to Linguafolio and Linguafolio Online, it provided such an elegant solution to a lot of the issues that I was having as a teacher. So I'm hoping to share some of the reasons that it's so meaningful with you today, talk about really important considerations for implementation, and then we'll visit the tool a bit so that you can get an idea of how it works, and I can answer any questions that you might have about that. Okay. Let's get started. So quickly, a session overview, introductions, which we just did. Next, we'll talk a lot about pedagogical considerations for portfolio learning. And then finally, a practical implementation of portfolio learning. The big outcomes for today are I can demonstrate understanding of the necessful reflective cycle. I can identify practical approaches to implementing student-centered learning in the classroom. And then I can explain how to use Virginia Linguafolio Online in my classroom to promote reflective learning. So to start everything off, I'd like to start with this reflective learning cycle. If we're just starting at the top, which is a logical place to start, we essentially, when we use language portfolios, we really have to talk about setting and adjusting learning goals. As world language educators, we are lucky because we have these ready-made can-do statements that serve as examples that we can tailor to our own classroom context that we can draw from, that are released by Necessful and Actful. And the most recent ones were released in 2017, so we're working with really fresh material. The next step, and this is the step that I think we see the most growth from students, is selecting strategies. So you know what you want to achieve, and now you have to figure out ways to achieve it. For example, if you've realized, say your goal is to be able to write or talk with someone in a chat room that you just met, and you realize you don't have a lot of vocabulary knowledge, you might want to pick some vocabulary learning strategies like building semantic maps or even circumlocution to help you negotiate that space. The next step in portfolio learning and the reflective learning process is providing evidence. You say you've learned something, that's wonderful. Now, how have you learned it? Well, how can you prove that you've learned it? And lastly, self-assessment and reflection. Learning is a process. Language acquisition is a process. It's likely for our students that they need multiple pieces of evidence to reflect upon before they finally reach their goal. In that sense, when a lot of times the word portfolio connotes a summative grouping of some exemplary work from students or practitioners. In this case, Linguafolio and learning portfolios, as I'll talk about them today, are really designed to document the journey of learning more so than to showcase the ultimate outcome, which I think is really powerful. And another important point here is you'll see I've added in these arrows that go the other way. The reflective learning process, we often talk about it starting with the goals and then moving to the strategies, providing evidence and self-assessment and reflection, which then yields to new goals or adjusted goals. And while that is absolutely true, it also indicates that perhaps reflective learning is a really linear process. And that's not always the case. For example, I might provide evidence because I'm thrust into a communicative scenario that I didn't expect. So perhaps I go to a restaurant where everybody speaks the target language and I try to order something and I don't know how. I've already created evidence. I can self-assess and reflect on it, and that'll yield me creating goals. Right? It's not necessarily that I start with the goals. However, all of these parts are connected. The strategies I use, the evidence I create, the goals themselves, and the articulation of those, and the self-assessment and the reflection pieces are all connected and unified. So why goals? They're everywhere. I have to say this. So I want everyone to just take 3 minutes. The first minute will be within your groups at your sites. I want you to chat about what you see here. Really objective language. I've entitled this slide The Ubiquitous Nature of Goals, but what do you see? What are these images? Chat about those, and after 1 minute, and I'll let you know when your minute is up, if you could please type some responses in the chat box. And your 1 minute begins now. Okay, that indicates that the 1 minute of what you see here, that time is up, so I will be looking at the answers that you add. And we'll discuss them a little bit. Great. So I've seen lots of great answers come up. The first one I see is goals need to be specific, measurable, and evolve. I certainly see that here. On the left, we have these images of activity monitors that show your heart rate. They show how many steps you've taken. They can even track how long you've slept, all these different indicators of health. And while the science is a little bit out on how accurate these are, they certainly provide information that lets you help set specific goals and track them over time. Another great point that you all brought up in the chat box is that we see short-term goals and long-term goals. I think any of these can connect. So on the left, the Fitbits might be a short-term and a long-term goal. So maybe I have a goal for this week I want to make sure that every day I hit this many steps. I know that with the Fitbit app itself, you actually can challenge friends. So maybe my goal this week is to have more steps than my other friend who has a Fitbit. Where in the center, we see a vision board. So we see a bunch of goals for somebody. And these are things that a lot of them at least seem to be. She's not here or he's not here to tell us about this more specifically, but we see things like routine, something that indicates daily intentional practice. Let's see. Ideas that keep you accountable and focused on your goal. I love that, especially when we set goals for ourselves. It's, and this is true for humans, not just us as teachers, not just our students as students, but just us as humans. Sometimes it can be hard because change is hard work to remember your goals. And so things like a meal plan, things like a vision board, or even like a Fitbit are good reminders to stick with the goals that you thought for yourself. Goals that we want to see over a period of time, all aspects of life, not just learning. I think that's great. Goals need to be planned, visual reminders. So, right, we are all, you guys are taking some of the words right out of my mouth. We see goals actually everywhere in our lives. And when they're really meaningful goals, they're something that require work. So let me come to this next. That brings us to this discussion that I think is an important differentiation. In the literature about goals, we really see two different types of goals: mastery goals and performance goals. What we want is to work with our students so that their learning goals become mastery goals. And you can kind of see the difference right here. A mastery, and I should say this before I continue. In this literature, we refer to performance goals as performance goals, but they don't necessarily connect to proficiency versus performance when we talk about assessment. So I do want to say that even though that word is used in this context, and it's also used in a strict language learning context, they're not used the same way. But to differentiate these differences, I have these mastery goals. This is something that's sustained over time. I'm willing to work for and try for. I want to learn enough Spanish to study abroad in 2 years and live with a host family. It's specific. I know that I need to have a certain amount of everyday, I need to master a lot of everyday language functions, and I know by when I want to achieve it. Whereas a performance goal is I want to get an A in Spanish. I can give you a slight anecdote about my own life. I had plenty of these in college. I took lots of classes I didn't care about, but I had to get out of there, and I was an overachiever, and so I wanted to get an A. That was my only goal. I was very performance oriented there. I avoided taking risks because I didn't want to fail. I definitely was motivated by achievement, and if I failed, it was immediately internalized as lacking some sort of ability. Whereas with mastery goals, our frame is completely different. We're focused on enduring achievement, establishing patterns of behavior and skill development, and a growth mindset really starts to develop when we have these mastery goals instead of a fixed mindset. So I bring this excerpt from a book called Girl Wash Your Face. It is not it's not very research heavy at all, but it is, I would qualify it as a self-help book. And she tells this story about how she went out with friends one day, and it was supposed to be just after work to get a drink, and then they ended going out after work and staying out for dinner, and it became this whole thing. When she got home, she decided, she had said all day that she was going to run 2 miles on her treadmill. So when she got home, she ran the 2 miles, and her friends started texting her saying, like, I can't believe you're running. We just had this great night. Why would you do that? And she said, I promised myself that I would do it, and I never break those promises. What we see with her mindset is it's really mastery focused. She has a very personal connection to the goal. She doesn't think of achieving goals as enduring against challenges that exist, but rather as a progress forward. And she trains herself to persevere even when things are frustrating. So, having established the difference, I want to pause for a second about before I go to the next piece about mastering performance goals and just give you all a moment to pose any questions that you have there. And we will move on to the next step after that if there are no questions. Okay. If any pop in your brain, please feel free to share them in the chat. I will come here. So we are going to watch this video. We'll watch almost all of it. And it's about motivation broadly. To the side, you'll see this is a thinking routine that I recommend you use in your classroom, where essentially you identify what's going on, what facts and events are related to it, and where you need more information to understand more deeply. I'm not going to ask you to necessarily engage in that whole routine right now, but I did want to highlight that for texts like this thinking routine, the reporter's notebook, is a really great one to use to break down in the classroom. So here we go.
Our motivations are unbelievably interesting. I mean, I find I've been working on this for a few years, and I just find the topic still so amazingly engaging and interesting. So I want to tell you about that. The science is really surprising. The science is a little bit freaky. Okay, we are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think. There's a whole set of unbelievably interesting studies. I want to give you two that call into question this idea that if you reward something, you get more of the behavior you want. If you punish something, you get less of it. So let's go from London to the mean streets of Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the northeastern part of the United States. And let's talk about a study done at MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Here's what they did. They took a whole group of students and they gave them a set of challenges. Things like memorizing strings of digits, solving word puzzles, other kinds of spatial puzzles, even physical tasks like throwing a ball through a hoop. Okay, they gave them these challenges and they said to incentivize their performance, they gave them 3 levels of rewards. Okay, so if you did pretty well, you got a small monetary reward. If you did medium well, you got a medium monetary reward. And if you did really well, if you were one of the top performers, you got a large cash prize. Okay, we've seen this movie before. This is essentially a typical motivation scheme within organizations, right? We reward the very top performers. We ignore the low performers and the other folks kind of in the middle. Okay, get a little bit. So what happens? They do the test. They have these incentives. Here's what they found out. 1, as long as the task involved only mechanical skill, bonuses worked as they would be expected. The higher the pay, the better their performance. Okay, that makes sense. But here's what happens. But once the task called for even rudimentary cognitive skill, a larger reward led to poorer performance. Now, this is strange, right? A larger reward led to poorer performance? How can that possibly be? Now, what's interesting about this is that these folks here who did this are all economists, 2 at MIT, 1 at the University of Chicago, 1 at Carnegie Mellon, okay? Top tier of the economics profession. And they're reaching this conclusion that seems contrary to what a lot of us learned in economics, which is that the higher the reward, the better their performance. And they're saying that once you get above rudimentary cognitive skill, it's the other way around. Which seems like this kind of, the idea that these rewards don't work that way seems vaguely left-wing and socialist, doesn't it? It's kind of this kind of weird socialist conspiracy. For those of you who have those conspiracy theories, I want to point out the notoriously left-wing socialist group that financed the research, the Federal Reserve Bank. So this is the mainstream of the mainstream coming to a conclusion that's quite surprising. It seems to defy the laws of behavioral physics. So this is strange. It's strange finding. So what do? They say, this is freaky. Let's go test it somewhere else. Maybe that $50 or $60 prize isn't sufficiently motivating for an MIT student, right? So So let's go to a place where $50 is actually more significant relatively. Right? So let's take the experiment. We're going to go to Madurai, India, rural India, where $50, $60, whatever the number was, is actually a significant sum of money. So they replicated the experiment in India roughly as follows. Small rewards, the equivalent of 2 weeks' salary. Small performance, low performance, 2 weeks' salary. Medium performance, about a month's salary. High performance, about 2 months' salary. Okay, so those are real good incentives. Okay, so you're going to get a different result here. Well, what happened though was that the people offered the medium reward did no better than the people offered the small reward. But this time around, the people offered the top reward. They did worst of all. Higher incentives led to worse performance. What's interesting about this is that it actually isn't all that anomalous. This has been replicated over and over and over again by psychologists, by some extent by sociologists, and by economists, over and over and over again. For simple, straightforward tasks, those kinds of incentives, if you do this, then you get that, they're great. For tasks that are algorithmic, set of rules where you have to just follow along and get a right answer, if-then rewards, carrots and sticks, outstanding. But when the task gets more complicated, when it requires some conceptual, creative thinking, those kinds of motivators demonstrably don't work. In fact, money is a motivator at work, but in a slightly strange way. If you don't pay people enough, they won't be motivated. What's curious about, there's another paradox here, which is that the best use of money as a motivator is to pay people enough to take the issue of money off the table. Pay people enough so that they're not thinking about money and they're thinking about the work. Now, once you do that, it turns out there are 3 factors that the science shows lead to better performance, not to mention personal satisfaction. Autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Autonomy is our desire to be self-directed, to direct our own lives. Now, in many ways, traditional notions of management run afoul of that. Management is great if you want compliance, but if you want engagement, which is what we want in the workforce today as people are doing more complicated, sophisticated things, self-direction is better. Let me give you some examples of this, of almost radical forms of self-direction in the workplace that lead to good results. Let's start with this company right here, Atlassian, an Australian company. It's a software company, and they do something really cool. Once a quarter on a Thursday afternoon, they say to their developers, for the next 24 hours, you can work on anything you want. You can work on it the way you want. You can work on it with whomever you want. All we ask is that you show the results to the company at the end of those 24 hours in this fun kind of meeting, not a star chamber session, but this fun meeting with beer and cake and fun and other things like that. It turns out that that one day of pure undiluted autonomy has led to a whole array of fixes for existing software, a whole array of ideas for new products that otherwise had never emerged. One day. Now, this is not an if-then incentive. This is not the sort of thing that I would have done 3 years ago before I knew this research. I would have said, you want people to be creative and innovative? Give them a freaking innovation bonus. If you do something cool, I'll give you $2,500. They're not doing this at all. They're essentially saying, you probably want to do something interesting. Let me just get out of your way. One day of autonomy produces things that had never emerged. Now, let's talk about mastery. Mastery is our urge to get better at stuff. We like to get better at stuff. This is why people play musical instruments on the weekend. You got all these people who are acting in ways that seem irrational economically. They play musical instruments on weekends. Why? It's not going to get them a mate. It's not going to make them any money. Why are they doing it? Because it's fun, because you get better at it, and that's satisfying. Go back in time a little bit. I imagine this if I went to my first economics professor, a woman named Mary Alice Schulman, and I went to her in 1983 and said, Professor Schulman, can I talk to you after class for a moment? Yeah. I got this inkling. I got this idea for a business model. I just want to run it past you. Here's how it would work. You get a bunch of people around the world who are doing highly skilled work, but they're willing to do it for free and volunteer their time, 20, sometimes 30 hours a week. Okay, she's looking at you somewhat skeptically there. Oh, but I'm not done. And then what they create, they give it away rather than sell it. It's going to be huge. I mean, she truly would have thought I was insane. Okay, it seemed to fly in the face of so many things. But what do you have? You have Linux powering 1 out of 4 corporate servers in Fortune 500 companies, Apache powering more than the majority of web servers, Wikipedia. What's going on? Why are people doing this? Why are these people, many of whom are technically sophisticated, highly skilled people who have jobs? Okay? They have jobs. They're working at jobs for pay, doing challenging doing sophisticated technological work. And yet, during their limited discretionary time, they do equally, if not more, technically sophisticated work, not for their employer, but for someone else for free. That's a strange economic behavior. Economists who look into it, why are they doing this? It's overwhelmingly clear. Challenge and mastery, along with making a contribution. That's it. What you see more and more is a rise of what you might call the purpose motive. Is that more and more organizations want to have some kind of transcendent purpose, partly because it makes coming to work better, partly because that's the way to get better talent. And what we're seeing now is, in some ways, when the profit motive becomes unmoored from the purpose motive, bad things happen. Bad things ethically sometimes, but also bad things just like not good stuff, like crappy products, like lame services, like uninspiring places to work. That when the profit motive is paramount, or when it becomes completely unhitched from the purpose motive, it's just people don't do great things. More and more organizations are realizing this and sort of disturbing the categories between what's profit and what's purpose. And I think that actually heralds something interesting. And I think that the organizations that are flourishing, whether they're profit, for profit, or somewhere in between, are animated by this purpose model. Let me give you a couple of examples. Here's the founder of Skype. He says, our goal is to be disruptive, but in the cause of making the world a better place. Pretty good purpose. Here's Steve Jobs. I want to put a ding in the universe. All right? That's the kind of thing that might get you up in the morning and racing to go to work. So I think that that we are purpose maximizers, not only profit maximizers. I think the science shows that we care about mastery very, very deeply. And the science shows that we want to be self-directed. And I think that the big takeaway here is that if we start treating people like people and not assuming that they're simply horses, slower, smaller, better smelling horses, if we get past this kind of ideology of carrots and sticks and look at the science, I think we can actually build organizations and work lives that make us better off. But I also think they have the promise to make our world just a little bit better.
Okay. So, what does all of this mean for setting goals? I just gave you research. Dan Pink is the researcher. His book Drive is pretty readily available if you haven't read it yet, but he summarized a lot of what he says there. He says in the book right there. We have this idea that really stuck out to me. If then tasks, the rewards are incentivizing. So if you get all of these things correct on this quiz, I will give you 3 stickers. That's something that is incentivizing, unless, though, the test requires a lot of cognitive skills. And then these rewards are actually disincentivizing. So what does all this mean when it comes to setting goals for our students, our teachers, for world language education, for education as a whole? What does all of this mean? After looking at that research, take, I guess, let's see what time it is now, 4 minutes in your groups, and I'll start the timer so I don't let us go over, to chat through what that research means for our classroom. How do we promote mastery, autonomy, and purpose with our learners? How do we goals? Big questions, but only 4 minutes to chat through it, and I look forward to your answers in the chat box in a few minutes. There are about 40 seconds left just to give you all a warning. All right, the 4 minutes are up. I will give another little bit for people to type in their answers. And also, if you'd like another minute or so, you can feel free to request it. I'm happy to grant that. I know I asked some big questions. UVA Charlottesville, I see your question and I think it's a really important one and I'll talk about it. I'll give one more minute to read through these and then I'll start chatting through them. I'll start talking through them and then if you still are typing, please don't feel rushed. Feel free to add them in and I will address them as I get down the. Oh, okay. And I want to thank you all for your really thoughtful answers here. What I see is a diversity of experiences with real life classrooms. And I see the fact that you deal with a diversity of students. And that's a really huge task to attend to the needs of 35. I've worked with some schools that their caps are 45 or 46 kids per class at one time means that it is difficult to achieve really intimate knowledge of what actually motivates students. Like, what do they actually want to master? So, hopefully, I can address all of these concerns in many different ways. So, I want to start with this idea that when grades or money are off the table, that UVA Charlottesville brought up. The fact is that for teachers, money is on the table, and I'm unfamiliar with the incentive structures within the state of Virginia. So I can't speak to those specifically, but I will speak specifically to what it means for grades to be off the table. And I think a lot of that work is related to a shift towards mastery rubrics from a 100-point scale. The issue with a 100-point scale and what I will call, at least in the United States, more traditional grading approaches is that there is an idea that every paper is a potential 100. And then for certain errors, you take off certain amounts of points. And so while the student potentially started at 100, they lost points throughout the task. We see that approach as not very incentivizing, actually. Whereas mastery rubrics kind of flip that on its side. So what a mastery rubric does is for those of you who are unfamiliar, is it usually gives 4 levels of achievement. The bottom level of achievement is essentially does not meet expectations. So at this level of achievement, the students are unable to approach what you need. If we're talking about an A through F grading scale, this would be like an F, D minus area, assuming students get credit for a D within your institution, or assuming your students don't get credit for a D within your institution, which I know is the case for a lot of folks. Whereas when we get to the level above, the second level achievement, that's really meeting expectations. It may not be meeting expectations at an extreme level. It may not be meeting expectations and knocking people's socks off, but it really is meeting proficiency area expectations. Whereas above that, we obviously get better to where at the top level, we're at exemplary status, the fourth level. And what using those rubrics does is it changes the way you grade. So instead of starting at 100 points and taking off points for what students get wrong, you start off at the idea that everything is almost like a thermometer. So every assignment that you're evaluating starts at a 0 and it heats up based on how good it is. And the further up you go, the higher up the rubric you go. So what you're able to prove you know is what gives you your grade instead of being penalized for what you don't know. And it seems like a small shift because really if we're grading appropriately, the outcome should be the same. But you're asking your students to focus more on what it is that they can do, can do statements, fun connection, but what it is that they can do to achieve. And so when we're using mastery rubrics, if we're implementing them appropriately, fear of failure typically goes away. Because now instead of 70 chances to fail on a traditional way a 100-point scale is determined, there's 1 chance to fail out of 4. We see that failure is at the very bottom, whereas we are more interested in documenting at what level you're achieving. So that helps take the issue of grades off the table for students. What it also does is it encourages those who are high achievers to take risks, because without taking risks, they can't possibly achieve the highest level. When I've implemented mastery rubrics in my classes, no matter what, standard Spanish 1 through IB Spanish 5, what has happened is typically those top achievers that, they always cross their T's and dot their I's and really focus in, their grades have dropped a little bit. And while they're learning how to really push themselves and try new and more difficult things. Whereas those who aren't as good at the doing of school, but still have the cognitive ability, but they have these certain behaviors that might limit them for success in a traditional context, they actually start motivated to build the right behaviors. And so I really highly recommend that shift to mastery rubric. The way that connects to Linguafolio Online and Linguafolio, if you're familiar with it, Linguafolio really has 4 levels of achievement as well. There is the this is a goal, which is essentially a euphemism, can't do, right? I really don't know what to do here. I can't handle this task. Whereas we see can do with help. Now I'm cooking with some gas here. I might be able to do most of this. Maybe it's send text messages to friends, but maybe I have to look up a word, or I don't know what this SMS abbreviation means, things like that. Whereas can do, I can do this. And then can do well is I'm really excelling at this piece. So we see that connection between this mastery focus and how students are asked to self-evaluate in Linguafolio Online. Let me keep scrolling down. A question we're still pondering is how to help the students move towards mastery goals and uncover what truly motivates them. There is a great deal of research about what you are asking there. And within world language context, especially in second language acquisition and really what we see is that when students actualize tasks, the tasks feel meaningful. The students do better, which is unsurprising. It's just like we saw in the video, right? People feel like playing the guitar is meaningful, so they're willing to do it, they're willing to persevere. We see it in video gaming. Mario is trying to save the princess, and who cares? Mario doesn't care if he's fallen in the pit 100 times. He's still motivated to um, save the princess. There's a bit about this that has to do with just resilience and being to take risks and not being scared to fail. And we'll talk about that in more depth a little later on in the presentation. The other bit, the honest truth is, unless the students tell us what motivates them, what they really want to learn, we can never know. We can never know. If we can't sit and interview our students all the time, which I know for most of us is actually illogical. There's no way to fit that in every day to meet with every student and be like, what is it that you want to learn today? Though I've seen some classrooms do it in interesting ways. What we can do is really harken back to the principles of authentic assessment. How can we, and when I say authentic, I don't really mean that the texts in world language circles authentic notes a lot of, text written by language speakers for language speakers. Um, what it really is creating these tasks that are real life. So thinking about, for example, and if my students are reading a short story or an article about an upcoming event, maybe it's Carnival, I'm thinking about because of Mardi Gras or something like that. Instead of giving them a bunch of true false questions, we can ask them to pretend they're going to Mardi Gras and are going to Carnival and fill out a schedule based on the information that they find in the article, or plan how much money they'll have to bring with them, or really think about how we can make their tasks that they do with language more like something, as much as possible, like something they would do in real life. Another thing is to involve them in the goal setting process. So what I've seen, there's this great school on the Oregon coast that does really cool things with goals. So the teacher always posts all of her goals at the beginning of a unit for the students. So all of the major can-do statements. And she asks the students both to self-evaluate on those before they've begun, and at the end of the unit, they self-evaluate again to get an idea of growth. But she also asks the students to look at the goal and personalize them some way. So they're supposed to pick 2 or 3, and they essentially, so maybe one of the goals is I can write an email to a friend. They can personalize it to like, I can write an email about an upcoming trip to a friend, or I can write an email to a friend that I've just met. And that gives them a slightly different lens that they're looking at, a slightly more focused lens that they're looking at when they're studying those tasks. And so she makes those personalized tasks, the students can actually slightly adapt their assessments to match the personalized task. In this case, with the emails, obviously, she would not prescribe who they have to write the email to. They can pretend they just it's somebody that they've already known and they're making plans with. The students can adapt a little bit that way, and she gives them some of that flexibility, which is another way to handle that. Let's see. Students need to define goals and have purpose in order to reach what they want. Absolutely. Autonomy assumes a level of investment or preparedness. Do we have it? That's a really great question and concern. A lot of educators that I've worked with before, including myself, if I'm being honest, when I first began teaching, I would hear autonomy and I would say, okay, like that doesn't actually mean anything to me. And so when I try to be autonomous, I'd be like, okay, today you guys need to learn this information. I'd be really vague and I'd send them out into the world. And guess what? They didn't have enough direction to even know what to do. And so one of the ways that we empower students to be autonomous learners is we make sure that we model and set aside time for practice of strategies for language learning. And that's that second phase in the necessful reflective cycle, right? Really modeling and practicing those strategies. Let's see. Sometimes students don't need to be motivated, they need to be convinced. I am intrigued by the differentiation you're bringing between motivating and convinced. The way I interpret this, Global Discovery Laboratories, and feel free to tell me if I'm wrong, is that students need to see the purpose of what you're doing, which convinces them of why they're even in the class. Many other folks are discussing high engagement, completing tasks they're interested in. Personally, I found how can we find motivate the students? And a lot of these last questions that I see, and feel free to keep typing, I'm happy to expand on anything that we need. A lot of these last questions I see really point to the idea that I mentioned before about authentication of tasks, is that our students are diverse. We as educators are tasked with trying to build, and this is what I hated when people would sing differentiation. You actually do have to have 35 lessons going on at once. We all know that that's actually an impossible task. But what we can do is think of ways like that teacher in Oregon I talked about to make our classrooms a little more flexible, allow the students to explore something that feels more meaningful. We also can give our students things I love in project-based learning, the inciting incident, something that causes students to feel the impact of the content they're about to learn. And so they tend to emotionally hook into it. I've even seen like optical illusions being used and get the students really involved with the optical illusions and describing the photos, and then that becomes a lesson on adjectives. And it becomes this thing that's really content oriented, but because it starts with this greater idea of connecting descriptions to ideas of perception versus reality, the students get more plugged into it. If you want more resources on that type of approach, Lynn Erickson's work on concept-based learning, which I could talk about forever because I love it, is a really good place to start. I can say it absolutely transformed my class to think about these greater ideas that my content connected into and using that to frame all of our learning. I wish I could talk more about it, but these are all really important concerns that you've brought up, and I really thank you for your thoughtful additions to our conversation. So that brings us to, we've talked a little bit about why goals. Let's talk about SMART goals. SMART goals, I think people actually talk about SMART goals now a little bit derisively because they're so well known in research. And so what we see is this is what Duran came up with in 1981, right? This is nothing terribly new, that goals are specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. Depending on your domain, you might actually see different letters for this acronym. And as long as each letter means something different, every once in a while someone comes up with two synonyms, it's fine to use those if you're more comfortable with other letters. But I just went back to what Duran originally came up with. So I gave you an example in a health focus, in my real life, not my academic life focus, of a goal that I could have. I have a specific goal to increase my energy and overall health. The way that I'm going to do that, this is the strategy piece in the reflective learning cycles. I'm going to work out more, 1 hour a day, 5 days a week. It's achievable for me if I wake up at 5 o'clock to work some so that I can protect time for working out. It's relevant, and I know that it's relevant to my goal because I'll see myself sweating all the time. But it's time bound. I have 7 days every week to complete those 5 exercises. I know what I'm trying to achieve, how I'm trying to achieve it, and by when I want to achieve it. So we see those in all domains, really. But what we see that's cool with reference to Linguafolio are what are called smarter goals, where Moeller, Thieler, and Wu, this is the result of a longitudinal study done over 5 years. The first year was a pilot, though, so we have 4 years of data. That they use SMART goals with students. So I'll go back just so you can see that. Again, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. And really train their students how to set goals, then evaluate their work and reflect upon it to help them set new goals and also think about how they can achieve, how they can better achieve or differently achieve in those contexts. That's where the comes from in SMARTer, evaluation and reflection. This research was incredibly and overwhelmingly positive. These were all Spanish students. What they saw was it was a correlational relationship, but it was positive between each component of the goal setting process. And that was writing goals, action plans, creating action plans. So that's the selecting strategies, and then reflecting on their evidence to their stamp scores. They saw the same type of proficiency gains that you would typically see in smaller classrooms. So we see this as a really practical way to help our students take ownership of their learning, to really select those strategies that will teach them what to do when they get into communication scenarios that are tricky or difficult or overwhelming. This is just to have fun. I went to a word cloud generator and I took their article and I put it in just to see what would come up. And I think what you see, I love that you see students learning and goals as the three most commonly used words. We also see process. We see Spanish because they're all Spanish classes, but we see action. We see all of these words that are really indicative of self-efficacy and helping learners to develop that. In other studies, what was really cool that researchers saw was that students who were good goal setters and could engage in this goal setting process, as articulated on this screen, actually had higher ACT scores, meaning that their gains were actually replicated across domains in all their other subject areas. So teaching the strategic component and really involving students in the goal setting process has really shown to improve outcomes, not just in world language, but across. Now, I saw a question before about how the students like get it done and it feels it's just something the students do to get it over with. There are lots of reasons we see that might happen. One of those reasons is that the students aren't involved in the goal setting process itself at some point, so they don't have much of a voice in articulating what the goals are or how they're achieved, and they need at least one of those two things. Another reason that could happen, it could be great goal setting process, but another reason that could happen is that the linguafolio piece, or in this case, the goal setting reflection piece in your class, or in your classes isn't consistent enough. The research that's most related to that is actually post-secondary. There's nothing in a secondary context, unfortunately. I wish I could give you some K-12 data. But what they saw with French and Spanish students, and I think there are 100 and 200 levels, so we're talking near novice learners, is that if they engaged with Linguafolio online and did meaningful reflections every 4 weeks, so at least 4 times in a 16-week semester, they found it to be very valuable. If they didn't engage that much, they found it to be something else that was just something else that they had to do, something that was slapped on top of all of their other work. It didn't connect to their other work. It just felt like an extra thing. Having not been to your school, it's difficult for me to say what might be going on, but I can at least give you that quick overview of what the research said. So in your groups, let's just talk, are these SMART goals or not? I took these, my students, and it's the fault of me for writing the prompt, but I have my online students write a goal before every term, and they share them in our opening discussion. I took these goals mostly from those discussions. I framed the conversation poorly, as you might see. Some of these are not very great goals. But how smart are these goals? Take another, let's see where we are. Take 2 minutes in your groups to identify, I guess, your favorite goal and your least favorite goal. And if you'll pop it in the chat, that would be great. Your groups should be deciding your favorite smart slash and not so smart goal about now. I'm typing them in. Right, I'll let the last few answers come in, but what I see here is you all get it. My favorite, and I get it every single term with every single group of students. I want to be fluent at the end of this term. You know, we have, in that school, we have 8-week terms divided up each semester, the half semester actually, which is an incredibly audacious goal, I will say. Um, the what waiters say in Costa Rica are be able to hail a cab and get the lowest fare possible. I think are really specific goals. I think if we're talking about a mastery goal, and they're both very smart goals. They're good goals, and we see the I want to be a doctor and be able to communicate with people who speak Spanish in that work. That could be more specific, certainly, but we certainly see some intrinsic motivation. We really see a mastery goal coming from a student. Um, but you're right. The I want to be fluent and I want to improve my grammar are overly vague. It reminds me of the time I had a student come to me and said, I just have one quick question before our assessment. And I taught in IB classes and AP classes. And I said, it was right before the end of the year test. I said, okay, sure. Can you just explain the subjunctive to me really fast? Like, that's not actually a very smart goal. The time does not work. And it's not very specific either. But yes, you guys absolutely get it. Absolutely. So let's come back here. So what's the strategy? We've been spending a lot of time about goals, and I promise I will go faster from here on out. But what's the strategy? When we think about strategic thinking, if you do a Google search, you're going to be brought to a ton of business websites. So what we see, we've kind of talked about the why and even the what. When we talked about the why would be like a purpose, motivation, or mastery mindedness. The what, the goal itself. The how, though, is equally important. Um, Something that we have to think about when we're teaching language strategies is that they actually help us to frame learning. There's this engineer who creates these crazy things on YouTube. This winter he went viral because he created packages that would explode glitter bombs on package thieves. But he's created the world's largest Nerf gun. He's created a dartboard that anticipates, basically has cameras in it and will move, so you always get a bullseye no matter when you throw it. Um, and what he likes to talk about is the Super Mario effect, which connects a lot with our first video. And it's essentially like when we start framing learning by by showing people how they're wrong, they stop being willing to try. They stop being willing to fail and try again. And so he did an experiment where he asked people to figure out some simple computer code, and he had 50,000 people do it. And what happened was, if he told the people who didn't figure out the code correctly, sorry, try again, you didn't do it correctly, they would go back and they would try 12 times. If he told the people that, sorry, you've lost 5 points, these 5 fake don't mean anything points, people would only try 5 times. And so we really want to see how to frame ways to make learning more about a process and not about a static achievement. That means that we have to balance rigor with relevance, right? We can't ever forget the achievable and realistic part. I think sometimes I get really excited talking about a growth mindset and talking about getting your students to be unafraid to fail and trying something that might be right outside of their grasp, that I forget to highlight that it still has to be achievably and realistic. I don't want to motivate my students by giving them something they could never do, because that is not motivating. And I also have to think of affect. Issues related to affect are huge in a world language classroom. We have a ton of students who are terrified to speak in Spanish or French or Italian, but they're also terrified to speak in English. That is just who they are as humans. Their affective filters shoot way up, whereas other students feel really uncomfortable writing. Some students have really complex emotional relationships with reading. We have all of these students who have affective filters popping up everywhere all the time. So, what can we do to help them? And the answer, really, in a lot of ways, is something that I don't think we actually question, but it's modeling and using language strategy, like circumlocution or like scanning for meaning, to help make everything digestible. So they're not ever enduring against their desire to quit. They feel like they have a tool to persevere. Um, some of that means for those of us, I was definitely guilty of this, and I think I'm still wired this way, is diminishing some of my focus on accuracy and increasing my focus on meaning, right? We hear this all the time, meaning over form. It also means diminishing our focus on obedience, and I mentioned this before. So doing the act of school, rewarding certain behaviors, and actually facilitating an environment where students are trying and really trying hard. So, one of the ways that we can facilitate said growth is by helping our students notice what happens in language that might be the same or different from what happens in their L1. So, here are two 1 minute videos. I think we'll actually just do this one, but they're both available for you here, that my center actually created as part of an app called Lingro to Go. But it gives like a 1 minute synopsis of what students should notice when they notice a basic language function, which is greeting. Oh, it's not going to play. We'll try this one. Then we'll go back this one. This one is about greeting your professors.
Greeting your professors. In Spanish, it is very important that students greet their professors and instructors every time they see them. Building a relationship through greetings shows that you care for and respect others. When meeting your professor for the first time, you will definitely want to use a formal greeting. Phrases like, Buenos días, ¿cómo está usted? And es un placer conocerlo are appropriate. However, as you get to know your professor, you might build a closer relationship, particularly if you take a lot of classes with him or her. As that happens, your greetings may take on a more personal tone. For example, your professor may ask you to use tú instead of usted, and you may find that your conversations also become much more interesting. Just keep in mind that no matter where you are in your relationship with your professors, greeting them is an extremely important first step. Don't miss out on this opportunity to build a great relationship, and always make time to show that you care.
See, in a little 1 minute and 20-second video, our goal with this was to get students to notice that there's an expectation in most Spanish-speaking countries. This is part of a whole series of lessons about studying abroad that are related to studying abroad. But to get students to notice that there's this social expectation in another country that doesn't exist in ours. What we see in a lot of research is that students may know something went wrong in an interaction. Another common thing is actually a classic saying I'm sorry in Spanish. The textbooks always say lo siento, which is not always the way you would say sorry for anything. Actually, especially, it's much more common to say things that are here oriented, like disculpa and things like that. And depending on the apology and how severe or how extreme the apology needs to be, then I might pull in a lo siento along with these other apologies. But what we see is students can notice that they've said an apology, what they thought was an apology, but the other people and the people don't accept it, but they don't actually notice why. They can't really pick it apart. So the more we can highlight those things that we know are difficult for students to understand in other languages and help them notice them happening in real life, the better we are. So let's do so that's one way to teach them how to really dissect communicative scenarios. Let me go back. Here's another way. It's really, oh, that video is not going to play. That's too bad. So this is a video to teach students how to do circumlocution, essentially, and it gives examples. So say you were telling a story and you forgot the word for bill or check. What are other phrases you could say to help so you don't have to stop and look it up or ask someone like, how do you say this in this language? And help them with that. And then we designed a series of activities to help the students practice it. In my own class, I did a game called Headbands, where essentially you wear a headband, you put a card in it, and you can't see what the word is that's on the card, and the other people have to describe it and get you to guess what it is. And I would do that with our classroom vocabulary. I'd make our own cards, and I would model it, and the students would practice it. And that way, when they got stuck writing something in an assessment or speaking, they had this skill to fall back on that made them feel more empowered. I have this puzzle piece here because in a very, I thought, really beautiful meeting that I had with the Linguafolio Committee, the National Linguafolio Committee, Ryan Wirtz from Ohio and Jackie Van Houten said that language is just a puzzle and you're trying to figure out how to put all the pieces together. So some simple ways to do that are to protect times with your students to help them make predictions about language. What are they going to read? What are they going to hear? What do they need to know before they engage in those tasks? To help them identify what language they actually know and use it to solve problems. Oftentimes they become overwhelmed by language that they don't know. So helping them shift their focus to what they can do and what they do know helps them kind of fill in the gaps. Either by taking an inventory, highlighting just what they know, writing down every word they can understand when they're listening, things along those lines. And then practice strategies, especially circumlocution, scanning, and semantic mapping, as much as you can fit in without getting in the way of your other work. I liked my activity with the headbands because that was a way to help them practice circumlocution and deliver vocabulary instruction without having to do two separate languages. So think creatively about that. So our next step is creating and evaluating evidence. With language portfolios, teachers, we should really think of ourselves as guides more than anything. We specialize in helping others to notice and understand artifacts. In this case, it's the work that they've created, but help them notice what's great about it, what could be improved about it, and to understand that's there. In some ways, we're lawyers in the sense that we advocate on behalf of our students. We use their evidence to create our case. And lastly, we're mentors. We provide input designed to yield growth. So that brings us to a really important point. What counts as evidence? And the answer is if you're using Linguafolio online or another language portfolio, it depends on how you're using it in your class. If you're using it summatively, you may not like this evidence or you may like it. Let's actually chat about it. So this is the can-do statement at the top. I can ask for help when shopping. You see two pieces of evidence that students may upload. The one on the left is a script between a customer and a clerk. The other one is a receipt. So talk with your groups if you think that this evidence actually serves to prove I can ask for help when shopping occurred well. 2 minutes to have those discussions. 20 more seconds. So if you and your groups could start typing your answers in, that would be very helpful. Thank you. Oh, there we go. I'll give groups a minute or so to type things in. I see quite a few typing in. We'll chat through. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start breaking apart. I certainly don't want to run over our time. We have some more to talk about. Breaking apart what I see from you all. And what I see from you all is that you're educators. And I love that. You are all absolutely right. If I were a teacher who was looking to evaluate how well a student could ask for help when shopping, and this was the evidence that the student provided, I could not actually give them input on how they spoke. I might have an idea that something happened, right? The evidence on the left, we don't know if the person just wrote down what was said right after it was said, if the person just gave a summary. We don't actually know the context for it. On the right, we obviously see was able to successfully shop. You're right that we don't have a lot of information, but this is where Linguafolio can really help deliver a sense of mastery and autonomy to students, is if, especially on their own personal goals, that it's not really the teacher's job necessarily to tell them if they asked for help when shopping well. What the teacher should do is have them say, okay, that was your evidence. How well do you think you achieved and why? Right? There's that next step. There's a great story that Ali Muller, the exiting president of Actful, has said. German exchange student, and one of her students wanted to ask the exchange student out and wanted to put it in his Linguafolio. And so they talked about what the evidence might be, and he didn't want to record the conversation because that would feel weird to record a spontaneous conversation. We're trying to get a girl to like you. So he had her check yes or no on a napkin and took a picture of the napkin, and that was the evidence. That was there. And for him, that was the learning experience. That's what he needed to really engage in his reflection and goal setting. Allie's goal is to help him think through the evidence and less to evaluate the evidence itself. But you guys are all absolutely right. If I needed this for a summative task to give the students a grade that had to go in the grade book to show their level of achievement, this is not enough. But if I'm really letting the students use the portfolio to document their own journey and their own pathway, then I can rid myself of the concern as a teacher of actually evaluating every piece of evidence and focus more on helping the students process the evidence and how well they think they did on the task at hand. Which gets us to the reflection and evaluation piece. We see evaluation and reflection all around us. Exit tickets are one of my favorite. So what should be reviewed in the future? How do you feel about your work today? We see like 2 stars and a question mark, right? What are 2 things you did really well? What do you still need to know? Rubrics give us plenty of tools to help students evaluate and reflect. I've seen classes with emojis and students can hold up the right emoji. I've seen that indicates how they're feeling about the content. I've seen fist to 5, fist being I don't understand anything you've said. 5, I understand everything, and those are quick checks where the teacher can get feedback and the students have to do a quick synopsis of where they are. This archaic pain scale that is used still in medicine, and then we see at the bottom these can-do statements. You'll see this more holistic scale of can do with help, and can't do. Where we can give feedback, though, for those of you who are interested in using Linguafolio online, is still important, right? So I might see one of these pieces of evidence for that can-do statement, and my student would like feedback on it. I could say something like this: that's great, but I need to hear more of your thoughts and opinions on the subject to say that you actually are at a can-do or a can-do well. Or that's great, but I don't know that you actually had the conversation. So in your reflection, make sure to think about how well you said what you said, if you understood what was being said to you, things along those lines. And then I don't have to spend all my time grading and noticing everything that's wrong. I can really facilitate my students' process to evaluate themselves. So making Virginia Linguafolio Online work for you. This is something that I wanted to show you. So this is the website. We don't have a ton of time. Maybe at the end, if we do, I can show you the site itself a little bit. But there are tech tutorials online. They don't look exactly like your website because they're created for the non-customized version of it, but they still walk you through all of the typical functionalities. When you go, you'll want to click sign up or get growing, and each of your schools have their own join code that you'll need to join. You can get that from Lisa Harris, or you can email lfolio@uoregon.edu, and we will tell you what your join code is so that you can start creating accounts there. I wanted to kind of talk through an example lesson to give you all an idea of if I were using Linguafolio online in my class, what I might do. But I see a question, and I'll get that right before we get there. I have a question on what motivates the students to participate in uploading content to Linguafolio if there's no grade attached. And how do you incorporate it into teaching if you still need to come up with other measures for assessing their progress? That's a great question. I'll start there before we go into the example task, as I think it's more foundational, actually. In the class with our students. Okay, thank you. So one question is, no grade attached that impacts their final grade is different than no grade attached. So I've done plenty of formative tasks with my students before with great success, where I still give them grades. So I might come up with Linguafolio with a 4-point scale. 4 would be a can do well, 1 would be can do with help, or this is a goal and still can't do it yet. And I document their progress on those different can-do statements in the grade book with a 1 through 4, but it's actually set to 0% of their score. So it doesn't impact their grade, but they see it and they realize that I'm looking at it. And sometimes that's all they need, and it gives me good documentation for their teachers, for their parents, and their students. I've seen other teachers use it as an optional assignment for extra credit. Extra credit is kind of a bad word in a lot of teaching contexts right now, so I'm not necessarily advocating that, just letting you know that I've seen it happen. And students tend to get excited about it. The way that I think it's most potently actually attached to grading is when teachers really evaluate goal setting and the reflective practice. They connect it to 21st century skills, typically, and when they design rubrics to evaluate the reflections, the students see a lot of growth there, and it feels really meaningful and focused. Let's see. Will you be sharing this link out the link to the presentation? Yes, you all may have everything that we have. And then, so let's talk through this. Let's pretend we're doing this lesson. We're going to do it very, very, very quickly. But so this is just some context for this lesson, some thinking questions. What words do I use to describe myself and others? What are they used? When are they used? Mode is interpersonal communication. Here's my benchmark that I pulled from the can-do statements. The indicators, I can exchange some personal information. And then related can-do statements, the last one is the one I'm really focusing on in this lesson. I can ask and talk about people who are close to me, family and friends. So you'll see here some scenes from Mean Girls. These are a little salacious. This is my caveat. This might not be the exact scene I use in my students depending on their age, but we see 2 different complete situations. In both of these situations, we see instances of asking and talking about people who are close to you. In the first instance, the girls have just met. In the second instance, they're a lot closer. and their language actually changes. In my class, I would have people brainstorm what can you say when you're first getting to know someone and what can't you say. So how would I describe myself, my family, and my friends when I first meet someone versus with someone I know really well? So the videos are short enough. To give you an idea, we have this first one. Oh, apparently it doesn't want to play either. Oh.
Why don't I know you? I'm new. I just moved here from Africa.
Sorry, here's the last piece that I would put in, is that after brainstorming those words, I would have the students listen to the videos and write down the different adjectives they heard or the different descriptors they heard in each scenario.
What? I used to be homeschooled.
Wait, what?
My mom taught me at home.
No, I know what homeschool is. I'm not retarded. So you've actually never been to a real school before?
Shut up. Shut up. I didn't say anything.
Homeschooled. That's really interesting.
Thanks.
You're like really pretty.
Thank you.
So you agree?
What?
You think you're really pretty?
Oh, I don't know.
Oh my god, I love your bracelet. Where did you get it?
Oh, my mom made it for me.
It's adorable.
So fetch.
What is fetch?
Oh, it's like slang from England.
So if you're from Africa, why are you white?
Okay, so we have an idea of adjectives that, and you'll see the reaction to that last question is not positive at the table. And they talk about, like, you should not say some of these things that they've said in this first one, where we look at the second time we're describing friends and family.
Hey!
Why were you talking to Janice Ian?
I don't know. I mean, she's so weird. She just, came up to me and started talking to me about crack.
She's so pathetic. Let me tell you something about Janice Ian. We were best friends in middle school. I know, right? It's so embarrassing. I don't even... Whatever. So then in 8th grade, I started going out with my first boyfriend, Kyle, who was totally gorgeous, but then he moved to Indiana. And Janice was, like, weirdly jealous of him. Like, if I would blow her off to hang out with Kyle, she'd be like, why didn't you call me back? And I'd be like, why are you so obsessed with me?
Okay, so we won't watch the whole clip, obviously. But see, you have this idea of where some of these sentences could not have been said in the very first conversation when they first got to meet each other. And in fact, when they started to use descriptors that were overly familiar in the first conversation, we see negative reactions. So I would have them watch that, notice that, and then this is where I'd insert my content, right? I might need to highlight word order in the target language. So if those videos were in Spanish, I would talk a lot about adjective placement versus noun placement, register concerns. So if I first met a friend versus first met an adult, would that change anything that I said? Again, adjectives, agreements, any relevant vocabulary, and then highlight any confusing terms that the students had. Then I would have them do a quick reflection. So there might be on a handout, did I do as well as I thought I would? Why? What am I most proud of? Why? And what specific task? Oh, I'm sorry. I skipped an important part. After that, the students would engage in some speed dating where they could practice having conversations. What's cool with Linguafolio Online is that you all in Virginia have an app as well, so the students could download to their mobile device and record their conversations that they're having in class and just upload them immediately there, and then have them reflect on how they performed and turn them in. So they would simulate conversations about when they just met someone versus conversations when pretend they had known the person for a long time, and really kind of practice using different descriptors and making them appropriate for that situation. I don't have to evaluate especially if they're doing like speed dating and I have 20 pieces of evidence per student. I don't have to evaluate every piece of evidence. I can give the class or individual students feedback. I can do corporate class discussions. I can pass out, this is something I love to do, is give post-it notes. So I'd put, like, if I heard something really good, I'd draw a star on it, hand it to them, like, that was awesome. Or I'd write, like, a note, like, careful with this, and give it to them. Have them upload with LFO to go is really, really easy if I want to give them individual feedback on one of them. I can ask them to record all of them and just upload one that they want me to see. There are a lot of ways I can negotiate it so I don't have to hear every single conversation and evaluate every conversation my students Then there are ways with conversations like that. We talked before about noticing socio-pragmatic norms, right? Noticing when language is used and how it's used. There are conversations that I can really extend into some intercultural conversations. And that's it. So some mechanisms to facilitate successful implementation. You want to craft a plan with Linguafolio Online or whatever portfolio you're using that fits your context before your program begins. Your program being your school year, your semester, whatever you're doing. So if it's that you will have reflection, your students engage in reflection at the end of the week, then always make sure that you plan for it. Practice, play, and experience Linguafolio ahead of time. Nothing is more frustrating than having the students try to upload evidence while they're trying to learn the platform. So give them a little time, and I'll show you very quickly a few tasks they can do to get to know the platform. Start talking about LFO and can-do statements from the beginning, and protect time for upload and review. So in a lot of cases, I know not every teacher has access to mobile devices. What teachers do is the students keep a folder of things that they've done for the week. And at the end of the week, they go to the computer lab and they upload the one piece of evidence that they're most proud of for the week. Some process like that works really well too. You want the students to have a basic idea of how to use it, language proficiency in general, how to self-evaluate. So here are some activities to help them get to know Linguafolio Online, right? Have them upload evidence to a can-do cluster, upload evidence with the advanced upload functions, find different pieces, and really spend like 20 minutes just having them do a race, see if they can find everything. Really break apart proficiency levels. So if their goals should be at a novice high, they need to understand what a novice high is. So have them figure out like, here's a sentence at these different levels, and really, so they can apply that to their ongoing practice. Have them think about how to use, this is a goal, can do with help, can do and can do well, outside of academic lives. Just so you see, this is what Linguafolio, the Virginia Linguafolio Online looks like. At the top, you'll see the can-do statements that can be assigned. At the bottom, you'll see the actual, these can-do clusters are the can-do statements that you have assigned, excuse me. At the top, you can upload, students can upload evidence to the goals you have set or goals they've set for themselves. And at the center, this is an atypical student, but you see their proficiency filled in as they upload evidence in number and quality. Those circles start to fill in. Some ideas, some examples of reflection. Here's some reflective questions you can have the students think about to guide reflection. And this is just that continued. And some pedagogical musts. People who succeed well with Linguafolio Online always have a proficiency orientation. They use can-do statements as learning targets. They engage in backwards design, and they ensure some way that students have voice and choice. If it's that this is the goal by the end of the week I want evidence for, you pick the evidence, that's one way to do it. If it is by letting them craft the goals themselves, but it's figuring out a way to really increase the student's voice and what they're doing. Closing thoughts. Linguafolio Online and reflection. It's a tool. So if we think about Linguafolio and Linguafolio Online, we know we have specific goals with the necessitable, actual, can-do statements. We know that they're measurable. We just have this is the goal, this holistic scale. We know that they're achievable because they're even divided into sub-proficiency levels. And we know that they're relevant because we can customize can-do statements to meet our context. Time-bound. Within the platform itself, you don't actually have to state by what time the goals will be achieved. So that's something you have to do in your class. Or when you work with your learners, have them think about when they want to achieve something by. The evaluation, they always evaluate how they performed when they're uploading their evidence, but that doesn't mean that they've engaged in deep, meaningful reflection. So using a tool like one of these to really guide those reflections is highly recommended. So is it enough? Is just throwing Linguafolio Online in your class going to change the culture, make your students more motivated, more autonomous learners? Not necessarily. It is a tool to help facilitate the creation of that atmosphere and the creation of that culture. But you have to figure out how to implement it into your context that fits in the best possible way. These are great questions to think about for your own practice. Writing your own SMART goal for yourself before you help your students write their own. And think about how can you promote autonomy? What structures can exist in your class to give your students some voice? How will you promote their mastery and their sense of purpose? And how will they be motivated to persevere in the face of failure? Is it that you're going to celebrate risk taking by doing things like handing out stickers every time somebody does something silly like that, or really cherishing those moments? Or is it going to be that you're really going to commit to mastery rubrics? What fits for you and your teaching style? So that is our very last slide. I am happy to hang out for any questions that you have. And also and I'll type it in the chat. Feel free. I know everybody has a really unique context. You have different students from a variety of backgrounds. You have different bell schedules and different constraints and different characteristics within your teaching practice that are within your locus of control and without. I will give you my email address. I'm happy to think through some of these issues with you as you and your colleagues encounter them. Please feel free to email me to talk through how you're implementing your Linguafolio online, or different structures you could use to help that. And I'm happy to do that. Me or someone on our team will connect with you. Is there a link to download document each learner's? Is there a link to download to document each? I'm sorry, Jamestown, I'm not quite sure I understand your question. What I can show you is as they proceed, you'll see that this My Proficiency overview actually starts to fill in. So the center level is novice low, and we have novice mid, novice high. So as the students upload evidence in higher quantity and quality, those arcs fill in. And so the students can visualize their growth over time there. And if that did not answer your question, I am happy to answer it differently. So there is, thank you. Is there a gradebook grid that shows levels of proficiency they reach for different can-do goals? So there are reports that once you've assigned, so at this bottom, you see a can-do cluster. If you click into it, you can actually see reports that are associated with your can-do statements you've assigned, and you can look at those by mode. You can, and with the whole class, you can look at them also just by can-do statement and see how many students have uploaded at a can-do well or a can-do with help. You can also look at everything by individual students, so you can look at their progress by mode and level, or by each individual can-do statement there. So those reports exist. They're not quite in the way that you presented it there, but you can get a decent snapshot. They don't export to a PDF for you to print, but we did create them so they would be easily printable on most platforms. And if you struggle with that, we're happy to help figure out how to change the settings or anything like that on your computer. Our tech team is super fast at getting back to users. What have you seen in terms of student reactions to utilizing Linguafolio in place of other forms of grading? That is a really good question. What we tend to see is that the programs that use Linguafolio as a way to document the journey of language learning and really protect time for reflection that goes along with it. So it's not just upload the evidence, I'll check it later. It's the upload the evidence and now write a reflection on why you think you are at a can-do well versus a can-do, and identify in your reflection if this is still a goal for you, if you're ready to move on to something else. When we see that piece happen, it feels really meaningful, and so students tend to engage really well with it. But it has to be, I say this, it has to be incorporated into class time. It gives it extra face validity, and you can certainly do some out of class, and that can be the expectation. but you want to give it face validity and not push it off as something extra. Because as we act as teachers that it's something extra and not as integral as it is to their growth, they will see it as extra as well. Is there a view as a student mode? So this is actually the student, right here, this is the student dashboard. Every teacher can create their own student account. You sign in at the same place, which is here we go. Sorry, I went too far. I did not go far enough, I mean. This virginialfo.uoregon.edu. Once you have the join code and create your accounts, we always suggest that you create a teacher account and a student account so you can sign in and see what the students see to help them troubleshoot. There are not videos about it, but there are, if you look on, and I'll type it in our chat box too, lfonetwork.uoregon.edu. There are PDF tutorials that walk through all the functionalities of Linguafolio online, what the student should be seeing in those, and they all have nice snapshots with arrows. This is where you should click. What was the purpose? There was primarily for schools are moving towards no grade. So that's a really good question about the history of Linguafolio. It was inspired by the European language portfolio way back when, and over a decade ago. I guess 2012 is when we first saw Linguafolio online really hit the scene. So it's a pretty new tool, actually. And the idea was to help learners really document the journey of learning. It was a shift towards a mastery focus in a classroom. And so we do see this idea, the separation between formative and summative tasks. And Linguafolio was really designed for formative, ongoing learning. That folio piece of it tends to connote the summative nature of things. And as teachers, we like summative assessments because there are clear expectations of the exact artifacts we expect to collect and things along those lines. But it's really about giving the students a tool to document their growth, to think about where they wanted to be, and think about how to get there. And so that was it. Now we see a variety of grading expectations around the world and around the United States. That is just a reality. I have thought through a variety of ways that it can fit in different grading mechanisms and grading different expectations that I would have based on the grading system that's imposed on me by administrators or my district supervisors or things along those lines. If you have a question about a specific one, feel free to put it in the chat. I'm also happy to set up a time to chat separately at another time by sending me an email, or we'll help you figure it out. But yes, it was originally this tool to document a journey and help students think about where they want to be with language, where they are, and how to get there. And of course, that's the thing. We all have very specific needs for each of our programs. And a lot of Linguafolio, for some of us, it fits right into what we've always done. I see a lot with schools that do different international curricula. It fits in more seamlessly than schools that might have a different curriculum approach and student assessment approach. And so it's really about making it be a tool that facilitates increased student outcomes for you, and using the parts that work and figuring out a way to make them work so that they actually reduce the load and shift the responsibility for learning to the students in a really meaningful way from you, and really make you the guide on the side, right? Really shifting into that space. And that's really where the power of this lies. Of course, I'll put my email, nights@uoregon.edu, for any follow-up that you might have. And then our tech support is lfolio@uoregon.edu if you're having any tech-related questions. But anything for pedagogy or implementation, reach out to me. If I can't help you quickly, I will connect you with someone else on our curriculum team. Everybody that I might connect you with is an experienced teacher from a different context. We represent a variety of contexts, and what we don't know how to answer ourselves, we collaborate on so that we can help make the most logical solution for people.